Well, what I find from this account of Abraham and his sacrifice of Isaac, and I don't want to stay too long on this, but it's something that I always come back to, is how this account, one thing this account teaches us is how intrinsically linked are faith and worship. Faith and worship are intrinsically linked together. So much so that you cannot have true worship without faith. And that an act of worship is, by definition, an act of faith. Because in this first mention of worship with this sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, there's the law of first mention in studying the Bible, which means the first time a word or a concept is brought up in the Bible, it's the most significant. And so we look at, when you really want to understand what worship is, what biblical worship is, you have to study this story. And that's going to teach you what true worship is. And what true worship ends up being is full submission to God, even when it makes no sense. True worship is submission to God when it makes no sense. It's sacrificing what is most valuable. It's trusting God for the better future, despite the pain of the present. It's all of these things. It's this act of faith when you have every reason to not do it. And faith is the only reason to do it. So if you want to understand worship, you have to understand this passage. If you understand, how do I truly, rightly, righteously, genuinely worship God, which, by the way, is the aim and intention of every religion throughout all humankind. That's every religion's goal, is to rightly worship God. We all just disagree about which is the acceptable method. But this portion of the Bible is instructive of this story is the right, true worship of God. And it's intrinsically linked with an act of faith.
I also think that this story of Abraham and Isaac is the quintessential definition of sacrifice, because I was thinking, I just did some calculating. Elon Musk, if he gave $1 million to the church was like, ooh, that's pretty good. But he could literally do that 20,000 more times and not even deplete his self-worth, his worth by 50%. That's not a sacrifice.
Right.
Abraham took the only son he had,
right,
and offered him. That's a true definition, I think, of sacrifice.
Right. It's the widow, right, who gives the mite, right? Where all the others who are great and wealthy, they give huge sums. But to them it's something they can afford to lose. But for the widow, it's all she has. That's all the money she has. And she gives it to God. And Jesus sees it, and what does he say? Truly I say to you, she gave more than anyone else here. Because the value of your worship is measured in what you sacrificed. What did it cost you? Not what does it value in compared to everyone else. It's what was its value to you? What did it cost you? And that's what real sacrifice is. That's what real worship is. You know, there's a book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and it's called The Cost of Discipleship. But in some of the opening chapters of that book, he deals with what he calls cheap grace, where we have settled for a cheap grace. We have taught so much that salvation is free, which it is in the sense that you can do nothing to earn it. But it's not in the sense that to believe in God, to truly worship and follow God, it actually costs you something. And guess what? Your salvation was purchased dearly with the highest cost possible. The life of the Son of God. Now, it was dearly bought. But if we peddle it cheaply, then there will be no value in it. And if our worship is only ever given through cheap means, we only ever give what we can afford to lose, then what's the value of our worship? Where God calls us to sacrifice, God calls us to worship truly. But if we never give what we can't afford to lose, then we've done nothing but give cheap gifts to God. And I can't tell you what that is or isn't. That's something between you and God, that only you and God know. Because what God requires of each person is different. You know, when the rich young ruler came to Jesus and said, Lord, what do I need to do to be saved? And Jesus said all these things, but it ended up at one thing you lack. Sell all you have and give it to the poor. The man couldn't do it. Which means what? Which means he had no faith and he had no worship. Right? Because he could not give what was required. That was the sacrifice to show true worship. Some people have never worshipped in their life. Think about that. We have this worthless definition of worship in our culture, where we say worship is when we all come on Sundays, we sing some songs, we sit in church, we listen to the pastor talk for 30 minutes, then we go home. I worshiped. You didn't do a second of worship. Because that cost you nothing. It cost you nothing. There are people who have never worshipped, truly worshipped, for a second in their whole life. And by people, I mean Christians. Because if worship has never cost you anything, then it's never been real. Jesus said, this is what I require. This is what's required. The man couldn't do it, which means that that man could never worship in spirit and in truth. Never in his whole life. But then you have Zacchaeus, who is another rich and more corrupt than this man. And the moment he encounters Jesus, he says, everything that I stole, I'm going to give back double. And then I'm going to give away more than that to the poor beyond. And guess what? Jesus never told him to do it. That's what trips us up, right? We expect that what Jesus told one person is what he's going to require of everybody, right? And so we read the story of the rich young ruler and we're like, oh, well, maybe I need to sell everything I have and give it away. Did he tell you to? Because that's what he told the rich young ruler. He did not tell Zacchaeus to do that. At no point after Zacchaeus' repentance does Jesus say, all right, well, now in order to have salvation, you need to go ahead and sell everything you have and give to the poor. Never exited Jesus' mouth, even though this man was rich through corrupt means, while the other man was rich, presumably, even though he had done all these righteous things. But Jesus never even told Zacchaeus to do it. That's something Zacchaeus wanted to do as a result of his salvation. And so What God will tell you to sacrifice may not be the same thing God tells me to sacrifice. And so, but whatever it is that God tells you to sacrifice, you must. Otherwise, you will never worship.